On the third and final day of the French president's visit to Marseille, Emmanuel Macron hosted a biodiversity summit. Message of the event that disappearing species and the destruction of ecosystems are no less existential threats to the planet than global warming. In the past 50 years, the planet has lost 2/3 of its land and marine vertebrates. Here's Emmanuel Macron speaking earlier.
It is urgent that everyone understands that the battle for the climate, the battle against climate change, goes hand in hand with the battle to preserve and restore biodiversity, and that both battles feed and depend on each other. We are lagging behind on defending biodiversity. We must catch up.
Well, our reporter Valerie Dekimpe is covering the week-long Congress for France 24. Valerie, hello to you. What sort of action is Emmanuel Macron calling for?
Well, we heard Emmanuel Macron just then urging world leaders to address both the climate crisis but also the biodiversity crisis. And that certainly seems to be the key message here in Marseille at the IUCN Congress, that we need to put biodiversity on top of the international agenda. Emmanuel Macron adding that we don't have a vaccine for a sick planet and that essentially we need to address both crises and that you can't solve one without the other. And it is a reality that on the international stage, climate change tends to dominate the agenda and also the headlines. We've all heard of the UN Climate Summit, COP26, coming up in Glasgow later in November, but not everybody has necessarily heard of COP15, the UN Biodiversity Summit taking place in Kunming, China later next year, where it is hoped that countries will agree on a Paris Agreement for nature, of course referring to the Paris Agreement for the climate. So that is going to be the main driving force of this summit, to put biodiversity on top of the international agenda. And so essentially what is going to happen over the next few days is that IUCN member states, NGOs, business leaders will be debating different proposals, will be sharing ideas, and the objective being to come up with a plan, with a strategy, a 4-year plan to protect biodiversity. And we are looking at an objective of protecting and restoring 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030, and some people even calling for an even more ambitious target of 50%, bearing in mind, for example, that Emmanuel Macron has already committed to protecting 30% of France's territory before 2022, and France is already on track to reach that target even before the other countries that have committed similar targets.
Yeah, and Valerie, one of the interesting ideas we heard that the Congress might address is putting a value on nature. What does that mean and how would that be applied?
Right, so this idea of nature-based recovery is gaining traction here in Marseille and among policymakers. It's this idea that nature has an inherent economic value and that protecting the environment is not just a nice to have, but it's actually crucial for the global economy. Now, according to IUCN estimates, for example, more than 50% of global GDP actually depends on healthy ecosystems, and yet we know that, for example, COVID-19 recovery plans, they tend to neglect and overlook nature and biodiversity. France, for example, less than 1% of its COVID-19 stimulus package is allocated for nature conservation. And that is why IUCN is calling for rich countries to redistribute some of the money that's been earmarked into COVID-19 recovery plans, more than $13 trillion US, and the IUCN is asking that at least 10% of that be invested in nature. Then there's another key theme that we're going to be hearing in discussions here in Marseille, and that is the link between human rights and the protection of the environment, especially the protection of indigenous rights and how they can be beneficial to ecosystems. Indigenous groups here in Marseille, for example, they have filed a motion to protect at least 80% of the Amazon Amazon by 2025. It's also interesting that for the first time in more than 7 years, indigenous groups have become an official member of IUCN. They're going to be participating in discussions alongside other IUCN members, for example. And another key issue that they want to address is how to make sure that the creation of protected areas, for example, does not come at the expense of indigenous groups and their livelihoods.
All right, Valerie, thank you very much. Valerie Dekimpe reporting from Marseille.